I will be presenting about the International Humanitarian Law. I will be first explaining a few important parts of IHL and important questions about IHL. First, what is International Humanitarian Law? International humanitarian law is a set of rules that seek to limit the effects of armed conflict. It lays out the responsibilities of states and non-state armed groups during an armed conflict. It is often referred to as the law of war, the laws and customs of war, or the law of armed conflict. IHL applies when there is an armed conflict. There are rules that govern conflict between two or more states and others that apply when the conflict is between actors within a state, such as in a civil war or a conflict between non-state armed groups. What is a violation of IHL? International humanitarian law forbids intentional attacks on civilians. Targeting them or critical civilian infrastructure, such as hospitals, could constitute a war crime. It also prohibits attacks on military objectives that do not take adequate precautions to avoid collateral harm to civilians. International humanitarian law is used in specific situations. They are used only for armed conflict. It does not cover internal tensions or disturbances such as isolated acts of violence. They are used once the conflict has begun and equally apply to both sides, regardless of who started the fighting. This might be the most important part. What are the four principles of international humanitarian law? These are very simple principles. First, do not attack non-combatants. Second, attack combatants only by legal means. Third, treat people in your power humanly. Last, protect the victims. As you guys can see, IHL mainly aims at protecting the civilians. Next is the sources of international humanitarian law. It basically means where IHL is mentioned. The four Geneva Conventions of 1949, together with the Hague Conventions of 1907 and customary international law, are the core sources of modern international humanitarian law. IHL is often broken down into two subcategories, referred to as Hague Law and Geneva Law. This division reflects the development of IHL, with Hague Law regulating the conduct of armies during hostilities and the Geneva Conventions regulating issues of protection and how other people should be treated. With the adoption of the additional protocols to the Geneva Conventions, which include extensive regulation of topics traditionally referred to as Hague Law, the separation is less relevant in today's practice. Last is why is IHL important in Ukraine? This is also the reason why I came up with this topic. As the war in Ukraine continues, civilians are being injured and killed at alarming numbers. Critical infrastructure such as hospitals and bridges has been destroyed. There have been more than 200 attacks on health centers in just over 3 months of war. Over 12 million people have been displaced, with some making it to Poland and the European Union, while others are trying to find safety in other areas of Ukraine. The International Rescue Committee is calling on all sides to adhere to international humanitarian law, the rules aimed at regulating, conduct, and protecting civilians in war. Mass suffering like that seen in Ukraine has become all too familiar, as these laws are disregarded in conflicts in Syria, Yemen, and Sahel region in Africa and around the world. The IRC strongly supports and echoes the United Nations Security General's call for adherence to international humanitarian law in the conflict in Ukraine, especially the protection of civilians and vulnerable groups such as women and girls. This is the end of my presentation today. I hope my presentation gave you enough information about IHL and helped you better understand the international world coping with Ukraine through IHL.